When Susan first noticed the strange holes in her baby's nose, she freaked out completely. She had no idea what could have possibly caused this or how potentially dangerous this was, but she soon learns. She went to the doctor that very afternoon, but when that man took a look at it, the message for Susan was not good. 40-year-old Susan is a single mother. She had dated in the past, but it had just never gone well. She hoped that this time it would be different. She'd spent a lot of time preparing for the date, and she really wanted it to go well, and it would be the first time they'd meet in person, but not everything would go to plan. She'd met the man online and knew it was a long shot, but she met up with him. The date was nothing extraordinary. He really didn't seem that interested in her baby, whom Susan got from a past relationship. She wasn't sure yet if she wanted to see him again after the date. The morning after her date, Susan discovered that there was something strange about baby Roy. It looked like Roy had a bad ache in his nose as he kept scratching his nose. But it wasn't until she looked closely at it that she saw exactly why his nose was hurting, and it scared the living daylight out of her. What was happening to her baby? The inside of Roy's nose was covered in tiny holes. She thought that maybe something had stuck to his nose, but bringing it closer to her, she saw that the holes were digging into his skin. She pressed on it with her finger and Roy started crying. Something was very clearly wrong, but what? She didn't really have any idea what she was dealing with. Her baby's health was on the line, so she took the leap and called the doctor. And the doctor's office set up a semi-emergency appointment for that same afternoon. They told her that there would be others ahead of baby Roy, but they would definitely see her by the end of the day at the latest. The doctor told Susan that she needed to think about anything that was different recently that could have caused this. Anything out of the ordinary. It would greatly help the doctor figure out what exactly was wrong. Susan agreed to think about it and hung up the phone. What could have done this? She didn't really know. Susan thought back over the last week. She and her baby hadn't really done anything too out of the ordinary. She and Roy went on a hike through the forest a couple days ago. The baby easily could have touched something out there before. Maybe a mushroom or a contaminated piece of moss. It was difficult to think of anything that was out of routine. Susan was an average girl. She didn't do much except hike occasionally and go to the local coffee shop. She worked from home and didn't go outside that much. She really was a boring person, but then it hit her. There was something else that was out of the ordinary. Susan had gone on the date the night before. She'd been talking with a man online for a while and had eventually decided to go on a date. Susan had been excited to try out dating again. She still hadn't found her soulmate and was hoping that this date would go well. Things would end up taking an unexpected turn. From the moment the date began, Susan felt like something was off about the man. He didn't really seem interested in her or her baby. It was almost like he despised her for being a single mom, but as soon as she would start thinking this, he'd do something that showed that he was invested. It was just a strange date, but there was something more. Thinking back, Susan wasn't sure why he'd even contacted her in the first place. Looking through her messages with him, she could see more and more that he didn't really like her. She'd just been a bit desperate and wasn't thinking clearly. Could he have something to do with all of this? Susan couldn't see how he'd have anything to do with this. They hadn't gotten physical at all and she hadn't contacted him since last night. He hadn't messaged her either. If he had done something, wouldn't he have said something? Susan wasn't sure, but it was time for Roy's appointment. She had to go. While in the waiting room at the doctor's office, baby Roy was getting a ridiculous amount of attention. At this point, the holes in his nose were very plain to see and everyone around him was shocked by what they were seeing. Susan didn't notice too much until the rest of the people's curiosity became increasingly obvious. Once inside his office, the doctor was able to take a proper look at Roy's nose and he was shocked. He had never seen anything like this. He would remember if he had. Something like this wasn't something you just forgot. And even more, the doctor hadn't even heard of anything like this in his medical books. He was clueless. The doctor ordered tests for Susan, and while they waited for the results, he studied Roy's nose intensely. The strange thing was that while earlier, baby Roy was crying, but he didn't anymore. His whole nose was completely numb. Susan decided that she needed some air and went to use the bathroom and let her baby sleep. While he was gone, the doctor received a private message from the forum. He opened it eagerly, hoping that it was the answer he'd been seeking, and to his luck, it was. But it was also terrible news and everything would have to change fast. Another doctor had indeed seen this condition before, and if they didn't do something soon, it could turn into a very big problem for everyone, including Susan. Susan's doctor waited for the results, which came in almost immediately after he'd read the message from the forum. This was it. He had the results and it chilled him to the bone. The other doctor had been right. Susan's doctor left his office and soon the whole place was upside down. Susan returned from the bathroom. Roy's nose was not looking good. The holes were starting to spread to the rest of his nose. Susan was getting really scared now, but she knew she had to show the doctor. There was just one problem. The door she'd just come through had been locked from the outside. She and her baby had been trapped in here, and to make things even worse, she could hear the doctor telling others that he had called the police. Nervous and scared, the staff's reaction to the baby's nose was really starting to worry her. What was so bad? Was he going to die? A million thoughts were running through her head. She tried to stay calm, but that was becoming impossible. After a few kicks, the door lock broke and the door swung wide open. The people on the other side started screaming and Susan's doctor stood back. Susan stood there panting hard. It hadn't been easy to kick the door open, but she needed answers and someone had to tell her what was going on right now. Susan's doctor ordered everyone else to get away and told Susan to stay back. She shouldn't get close to anyone right now. The fear on her doctor's face told Susan everything she needed to know about her and her baby's fate, but Susan was determined. She told them that she wouldn't stay back unless they gave her answers. Before her doctor could speak, 3 armed officers came into the building and spotted Susan. The doctor pointed at Susan and started screaming, "It's them!" All 3 officers took out their pistols and aimed them carefully at Susan, who was feeling faint now. What the heck was going on? Susan quickly threw her hands up into the air as the police turned their attention to her. She almost had tears in her eyes, and she begged them all to just tell her what was going on. Seeing that the holes on the Tremesur's nose thumb had taken up almost half of her nose, now the police told her to stay back. One of the officers calmly explained to Susan that they would tell her everything, but she and her baby needed to be isolated immediately. Her doctor firstly apologized for not telling Susan what was happening. He'd been scared. It wasn't every day that a person with an awful flesh-eating virus came in, and he had to follow procedures that he'd never had to do before. He felt awful, but there was more. He discussed with Susan what she'd been doing the day before. Susan had taken a hike and then had gone on a date that night. Luckily for Susan, the bad date hadn't been the cause of all of this. Instead, it was more likely that the baby touched some infected plant while out on their hike. But which one? Luckily for Susan, the hospital had the medication they needed, but the baby had to be in isolation for a while. The police had gotten involved because they had needed to talk to Susan about her hike, but when they'd seen her out of the isolated room, they had panicked because her doctor panicked. It was a big mess, but there was more. The officers had kept everyone off of the trail and after some heavy searching had found a plant that wasn't native to the area. It was tested and found to be the cause of Susan's problem. It was uprooted and disposed of. There haven't been any cases since, and within a month Susan was completely better and ready to go on dates again.